The question for tonight is it reasonable to believe that God exists? On the affirmative side, closest to me at the moment, we have Dr. William Lane Craig, Research Professor of Philosophy in the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University in La Mirada, California. Dr. Craig holds PhDs in both philosophy and theology and has published prolifically in both fields, including something on the order of 30 books. He's a veteran of the public debating circuit in the United States and has crossed swords with, among others, Richard Carrier, Bart Ehrman, Sam Harris, and the late Christopher Hitchens.
And me.
Our other speaker, further away, is Professor Lawrence Krauss, Foundation Professor in the School of Earth and Space Exploration at Arizona State University in Phoenix, Arizona. Professor Krauss has a PhD from MIT, and his extensive list of publications include the best-selling books The Physics of Star Trek and A Universe from Nothing. He's well known as a researcher, educator and public commentator, and is one of the stars of the recent film The Unbelievers. I now call upon Professor Craig to deliver his initial statement.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here this evening, and I want to begin by thanking the City Bible Forum for the opportunity to participate in this extraordinary series of 3 dialogues with Lawrence Krauss. And I want to thank in particular Dr. Krauss for his participation in the dialogues. They have been spirited, to say the least. And thank you to Graham Oppie as well. It's an honor to have such an eminent philosopher as our moderator this evening. Now, the question before us this evening is whether it's reasonable to believe that God exists. I'm going to interpret this question to mean, are there better arguments for God's existence than against God's existence? As a professional philosopher, I think that there are many good arguments for God's existence. So in my opening statement, let me just sketch several of the arguments that I'm prepared to discuss with Dr. Krauss tonight. Number 1, God is the best explanation of the origin of the universe. Atheists have typically maintained that the universe is eternal and uncreated. But we now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. In 2003, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. Their theorem implies that the quantum vacuum state, which may have characterized the early universe, cannot be eternal in the past, but must have had an absolute beginning. Even if our universe is just a tiny part of a so-called multiverse composed of many universes, their theorem requires that the multiverse itself must have an absolute beginning. Of course, highly speculative scenarios have been proposed to try to avoid this absolute beginning. These models are fraught with problems, but the bottom line is that none of these theories, even if true, succeeds in restoring an eternal past. Last year, at a conference at Cambridge celebrating the 70th birthday of Stephen Hawking, Vilenkin delivered a paper entitled, "Did the Universe Have a Beginning?" which surveyed current cosmology with respect to that question. He argued, and I quote, "None of these scenarios can actually be past eternal." He concluded, "All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning." But then the inevitable question arises. Why did the universe come into being? What brought the universe into existence? There must have been a transcendent cause which brought the universe into being. We can summarize our argument thus far as follows. 1, the universe began to exist. 2, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a transcendent cause. 3, therefore, the universe has a transcendent cause. Now, by the very nature of the case, that cause must be a transcendent, non-spatiotemporal, immaterial being. Now, there are only 2 types of things that could possibly fit that description. Either an abstract object, like a number, or else an unembodied mind or consciousness. But abstract objects can't cause anything. The number 7, for example, has no effect on anything. It follows, therefore, that the cause of the universe is plausibly an unembodied mind. And thus we are brought not merely to the first uncaused cause of the universe, but to its personal creator. Number 2, God is the best explanation of the applicability of mathematics to the physical world. Philosophers and scientists have puzzled over what physicist Eugene Wigner called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. How is it that a mathematical theorist like Peter Higgs can sit down at his desk and by poring over mathematical equations, predict the existence of a fundamental particle which 30 years later, after investing millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours, experimentalists are finally able to detect? Mathematics is the language of nature. But how is this to be explained? If mathematical objects are abstract entities causally isolated from the universe, then the applicability of mathematics is, in the words of philosopher of mathematics Mary Lang, just a happy coincidence. On the other hand, if mathematical objects are just useful fictions, then how is it that nature is written in the language of these fictions? The atheist has no explanation for the uncanny applicability of mathematics to the physical world. By contrast, the theist has a ready explanation. When God created the physical universe, he designed it on the mathematical structure that he had in mind. We can summarize this argument as follows. 1, if God did not exist, the applicability of mathematics would be just a happy coincidence. 2, but the applicability of mathematics is not just a happy coincidence. 3, it therefore follows that God exists. Number 3, God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. In recent decades, scientists have been stunned by the discovery that the initial conditions given in the Big Bang were fine-tuned for the existence of intelligent life with a precision and delicacy that literally defy human comprehension. This fine-tuning is of 2 sorts. First, when the laws of nature are expressed as mathematical equations, you find appearing in them certain constants, like the gravitational constant. The values of these constants are independent of the laws of nature. Second, in addition to these constants, there are certain arbitrary quantities, which are just put in as initial conditions on which the laws of nature operate. For example, the amount of entropy in the universe. Now, all of these constants and quantities fall into an extraordinarily narrow range of life-permitting values. Were these constants or quantities to be altered by less than a hair's breadth, the life-permitting balance would be destroyed and life would not exist anywhere in the cosmos. Now, there are 3 live explanatory options for this extraordinary fine-tuning: physical necessity, chance, or design. Physical necessity is not, however, a plausible explanation, because the finely tuned constants and quantities are independent of the laws of nature. Therefore, they are not physically necessary. So, could the fine-tuning be due to chance? Well, the problem with this explanation is that the odds of a life-permitting universe governed by our laws of nature are just so infinitesimal that they cannot be reasonably faced. Therefore, the proponents of chance have been forced to resort to a remarkable metaphysical hypothesis, namely the existence of a world ensemble of other universes, preferably infinite in number and randomly ordered, so that life-permitting universes would appear by chance somewhere in the ensemble. Not only is this hypothesis, to quote Richard Dawkins, an unparsimonious extravagance, but it faces an insuperable objection. There is no reason to think that most of the observable worlds in a world ensemble would be finely tuned worlds, rather than worlds in which, for example, a single brain fluctuates into existence out of the vacuum and observes its otherwise empty world. Thus, if our world were just a random member of a world ensemble, we ought to be having observations like that. Since we don't, that strongly disconfirms the world ensemble hypothesis. So chance is also not a plausible explanation. It follows that design is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe. Thus, the fine-tuning of the universe constitutes evidence for a cosmic designer. Number 4, God is the best explanation of objective moral values and duties in the world. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of moral values and duties which impose themselves upon us as objectively binding and true. For example, we all recognize that it's wrong to walk into an elementary school with an automatic weapon and shoot little boys and girls and their teachers. On a naturalistic view, however, there's nothing objectively wrong about this. Moral values are just the subjective byproducts of biological evolution and social conditioning. The atheist philosopher Alex Rosenberg is brutally honest about the implications of atheism. He declares, there is no such thing as morally right or wrong. Individual human life is meaningless and without ultimate moral value. We need to face the fact that nihilism is true. By contrast, the theist grounds objective moral values in God and our moral duties in His commands. The theist thus has the explanatory resources which the atheist lacks to ground objective moral values and duties. Hence, we may argue, 1, objective moral values and duties exist. 2, but if God did not exist, objective moral values and duties would not exist, from which it follows logically 3, therefore God exists. Number 5, God is the best explanation of the historical facts concerning the resurrection of Jesus. Most people think that Jesus' resurrection is something you just believe in by faith or not. But actually, there are 3 facts recognized by the majority of New Testament historians today, which I believe are best explained by the hypothesis of Jesus' resurrection. Namely, the discovery of his empty tomb on the Sunday morning following his crucifixion. 2, the appearances of Jesus alive after his death to various individuals and groups. And 3, his disciples suddenly and sincerely coming to believe that God raised him from the dead. And I'll be happy to discuss in detail any of these during our dialogue. Attempts to explain away these 3 great facts, like the disciples stole the body or Jesus wasn't really dead, have been universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there just is no plausible, naturalistic explanation of these three facts. And therefore, it seems to me the Christian is amply justified in believing that the best explanation of the evidence is that Jesus rose from the dead and therefore was who he claimed to be. But that entails that the God who raised Jesus from the dead exists. And thus we have a good inductive argument for the existence of God based on the resurrection of Jesus. Finally, number 6, God can be personally known and experienced. This isn't really an argument for God's existence. Rather, it's the claim that you can know that God exists wholly apart from arguments, simply by personally experiencing him. Philosophers call beliefs like this properly basic beliefs. They aren't based on some other beliefs. Rather, they're part of the foundation of a person's system of beliefs. Other properly basic beliefs would be belief in the reality of the past or the existence of the external world. In the same way, belief in God is, for those who seek him, a properly basic belief grounded in our experience of God. Now, if this is the case, then there's a danger that arguments for God could actually distract your attention from God himself. The Bible promises, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. We mustn't so concentrate on the external arguments that we fail to hear the inner voice of God speaking to our own hearts. For those who listen, God becomes a personal reality in their lives. In summary, then, we've seen 6 respects in which God provides a better explanation of the world than atheism. God is the best explanation of the origin of the universe. God is the best explanation of the applicability of mathematics to the physical world. God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. God is the best explanation of objective moral values and duties in the world. God is the best explanation of the historical facts concerning the resurrection of Jesus. And finally, God can be personally known and experienced. In our conversation to follow, I'm happy to discuss any and all of these arguments with Professor Krauss.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. I now call on Professor Krauss to give his initial statement.
Before I actually begin my presentation, I want to, echo the thanks of Dr. Craig. In many ways, I want to really, let's just see if all this all works now. Let's just see if my remote works. There we go. Okay, good. I want to thank the City Bible Forum. The people have been incredible to me and gracious, honorable, much to my surprise, and really charming. And I want to thank Peter and Robin and Emma, Craig in the back. And Robin today, I want to thank him also. It's the second time they've done this for me, and I want to mention it. I have a little bit of Black Label Johnny Walker whiskey here in honor of my late friend Christopher Hitchens, which was provided for me by the City Bar. And as I pointed out the other day in Sydney, that is a vast difference between Australia and the United States. It would never happen that a Christian group would provide me with whiskey before a talk. So I really do want to thank them, and I think they all deserve a round of applause for doing such a great job. I really do. Okay. So obviously you know the question. Well, the answer to the question is kind of obvious. We could get out of here quickly. It's no, but certainly if numbers matter, it's definitely not reasonable to believe in God. You know, humans created lots of gods over their history. Every single thing that happened to humans involved a god at some point or another over the time. The sun, the moon, the planets, the winds, the oceans. There have been over at least estimates of 1,000 different gods over human history. Okay? And there are lots of names, and We've gotten rid of them. Dr. Craig doesn't believe in them. Almost all of them, but one. So it's just a difference of one. He's an atheist about all these other gods for a good reason. That we've gotten rid of them because we now understand how the universe works, and we understand those stories are just stories that are inconsistent with the way the universe works. It's rational inquiry and physical understanding that has done that. I mean, the example that it reminds me of is, people don't, when it's not raining, you could pray for rain, or you can go to a meteorologist, and farmers will in general go to meteorologists now, because it works, and that's the fundamental difference. Now, God is at best irrelevant, and I mean at best irrelevant. Science has gotten rid of God from pretty well everywhere God used to reside. Used to have angels pushing the planets in orbits around the sun. Newton got rid of that. Used to be special creation, as we'll get to this. Every species looked like it was fine-tuned for the conditions in which it lived, meaning there had to be design. Does that argument seem familiar to you? Have you just heard it? Okay, well, that was the argument that was applied to life, but Darwin showed, in fact, natural selection and genetic mutation could easily, in fact, not only could easily, but does explain the diversity of life on Earth. Biochemistry, while we don't yet know the origin of life on Earth, is quickly convincing us that there's no divine spark, nothing difference between animate and inanimate matter except for biochemical processes. And I suspect in the lifetime of almost everyone in this room, given that most of you are younger than us, we will, in fact, learn how chemistry turned into biology. We also learn that even matter can be created and destroyed. Physics has taught us that, and as I've written and we discussed, we can learn that universes can be created and destroyed. No problem. So many of the things we needed God for are no longer there. But it's worse than that, of course. Why are some people hanging on to that one remaining God? I mean, if you ask yourself, how likely is it, given the complete lack of evidence for any divinity, that Yahweh, or whatever you want to call him, is not, and not one of the other 999 gods that we've dispensed with, how likely it is that one God exists? Well, it's unlikely, given that, the plethora of all the rest don't exist, and Christian apologists would argue against all the rest. Why, given what we know, do we want to apply everything that we don't understand to an invisible man in the sky when there's been no evidence whatsoever that any invisible man in the sky actually exists? And not only that, which invisible man in the sky? Because even in the modern monotheistic religions, there are incredible inconsistencies, and only one of them can be right. In fact, on the stage the other day, I asked Dr. Craig, what about Islam? And of course he said Islam is wrong. So that invisible man in the sky, who has his own set of values and morals and claims, is inconsistent. So even if you accept this one God, the God depends upon, as you'll see, where you live. But the most important thing is our current understanding of nature has actually changed. We call it learning. It's developed since the claims were first made by peasants, Iron Age peasants, who didn't even know the Earth orbited the sun. We have learned about how the universe works, and that has changed our opinion. And in fact, it's told us that the scriptures are inconsistent with what we know about science, empirical science and reason. So it's completely unreasonable to accept these old explanations because they just don't work. They disagree with the evidence. But finally, there's nothing absolutely new or special about Jesus. He's just as unpleasant as all the other gods. And all the stories of Jesus have occurred elsewhere. Now, in fact, I would argue most people who even call themselves religious choose reason over God. For many reasons. Most people who believe in the Judeo-Christian God don't really believe, in most part, the way people are happy to call themselves Christians or Jews, but they pick and choose from the scriptures. They say, well, Jonah didn't live inside a whale. I don't really like the idea that Lot told the people of Sodom, it's okay, rape my daughters because I don't want you to rape the angels, so go rape my daughters because they're just women, and women are chattel, and it's okay. I doubt many Catholics actually believe, in fact, I would be amazed to find any, including priests, who believe that when a priest blesses a wafer, it turns into the body of a first-century Jew. I was on a stage with several people from the Vatican astronomer, and several colleagues of mine, religious Catholics, and I asked them if any of them believed in the virgin birth, and not one of them would say they did. Now, the only thing, as Dr. Craig has pointed out, that seems to have gotten any currency is the resurrection. That's the one thing, and I was just talking to a member of the City Bible Forum who was happy enough to drive me to the airport in Sydney, and he said it was the resurrection that convinced him. And I think for Dr. Craig, it's probably the resurrection. We've already discussed this before. But, the point is that many of my colleagues, when I write a paper, they say, it's wrong, your paper's wrong, and I did it first. And I think that's the point. There's nothing new about a resurrection. It's as old as every God and every creation myth. There's lots of examples. Dionysus and Jesus are so close to being identical. They both were born from a virgin mother. They both had a divine father. They both were resurrected. They both transformed wine into water, etc., etc., etc. Osiris, the Egyptian god of life, death, he would, in fact, the new kingdom, this is almost 2,000 years before Christ, in principle, the idea was that people would be resurrected with Osiris if they followed the correct religious rituals. But the point about the resurrection is that there's no evidence of it. There's no evidence it would pass muster in a science lab, much less a court of law. It's hearsay, stories written based on oral traditions decades or hundreds of years after the fact, which are inconsistent with each other. There's nothing, when Dr. Craig tells me, and I said it before, historians of the Bible, theologians and people, scholars of the Bible, all accept that the resurrection happened. It reminds me of when I debate alien abduction experts who say, well, all alien abduction experts say people were abducted by aliens. Well, that doesn't mean much to me. Given that it's never been observationally verified, is it reasonable to expect that someone comes back from the dead? It's never been observed, never been seen. So is it reasonable to expect that it happened once when no one could see it and when no one actually reported on it at the time? No. In fact, the fact that people may have seen Jesus walking, if they report that, I'm willing to accept their belief that they did. But as Oliver Sacks has described it beautifully in a recent book, hallucinations are real to those people that experience them. Now, the fundamental, Christopher Hitchens really presented the fundamental irrationality of the premise of a Savior. We're asked to believe the following. First, that our God created our universe 14 billion years ago, except in many states in my country. And maybe Queensland. But anyway, then he waited almost 10 billion years before the Earth formed. Then he waited another 4 billion years until animals evolved. Then, over 2 million years, he watched as our poor hominid ancestors scraped out this meager, miserable existence without intervening, then waited another 250,000 years as the first Homo sapiens began to assemble into families and tribes beset by hunger and illness, individuals who are genetically identical to us, essentially, and presumably, therefore, have a soul, but who are presumably still suffering through eternity without grace because he chose not to save them, but then to introduce. After such remarkable negligence, he decided to reveal himself not in an era of video cameras like today, but in an era of Iron Age peasants, in a society at the time beset by myth and superstition, and not once since then. Come on. And worse, the fundamental premise of Christianity is so ridiculous that we are born sick and commanded to be well, as Christopher has said. So, the next aspect of faith and a belief in God that's ridiculous is miracles. Now, I once quoted this, and in fact, last time we met outside of this country, Dr. Craig said, well, philosophers don't buy it, but I'd like him to explain to you what's wrong with the argument. Basically, it says if a miracle is something that must be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. I mean, it's so, as Carl Sagan would have said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Or as Fox Mulder would have said, I want to believe. We all want to believe, and we should recognize that, and that's what science teaches us. We are all susceptible immediately to the idea that coincidences are special. Something that happens to us means a lot. And often, that belief resides in the discrepancy between the laws of probability and the workings of cognition. When something happens to you, it seems special. You can have 1,000 dreams that are ridiculous, and one night you dream a friend of yours is going to break their leg, and the next day they break their arm, you go, cosmic. But you forget all the nonsensical dreams. It's a natural tendency. And in science, we have to work against that. Coincidences happen. John Paul is now going to be a saint because some woman had a remission of a disease in 2011. Well, couldn't that just be a coincidence? As Feynman pointed out, the standards of proof in science are so different than those of the Catholic Church. In science, we try to prove ideas wrong as well as right. We don't just try and say, we like this, let's prove it right. And the best example I know, again, comes from Carl Sagan, Miracle at Lourdes. There was this apparition of the Virgin Mary in Lourdes, and many people have gone to bathe in the waters, and the Catholic Church keeps good records of it. and about 128 million pilgrims have gone there, and I think 56 have been cured of diseases, and they can say that they can't prove it's something else, and therefore they're miraculous. No one's regenerated an arm, but people have been in remission from cancer. But the interesting thing is, there's spontaneous remission rates of cancer in society, and if you actually look, the probability of having a remission from cancer if you go to Lourdes is smaller than that in the general population. But if you go to Lourdes and you come back and your cancer goes into remission, there's no way that I'm going to be able to convince you it's just an accident. And that's the problem of our own cognition in miracles. Now, the other thing that's obvious about what makes it unreasonable is the God that we've created is not the kind of, I mean, you know, if you were a God, omnipotent, would you be so petty and jealous? Would you say, hey, let me get you to almost kill your son to see if you believe in me? Okay? Or, you know what? I want you to prostrate before me 5 times a day to show you love me. I mean, if you had an ant farm, would you kill the ants if they didn't look up at you every day and tell you how wonderful you were? Okay? I mean, it's just kind of, for an omnipotent being, he's pretty petty. Or she. And even Christianity, which is supposed to be this loving religion, says, believe in me or go to hell for all eternity. Gee, thanks. Or, based on here's what I want to do. I'm going to kill my own son and torture him to absolve humanity from original sin associated with a non-existent forebear, Adam. I mean, it's nonsense. And if it was reasonable, it wouldn't depend on geography. What you believe depends upon where you come from. It's the U.S., you probably believe in the Bible and Jesus. If it's India, it's probably Brahmin. If it's the Islamic word, you believe in the Quran. It's the perfect word of God, and Muhammad is a prophet. And in fact, you'd have people, I've debated a clone of Dr. Craig's, in an Islamic clone, who uses exactly the same arguments to prove that the Quran is the word of God. The great thing is that the global access to information means that people are now learning that they don't have to accept those things and can think for themselves. And for that reason, religion is monotonically decreasing. That unreasonable belief in God is monotonically decreasing in all of the internet accessible world. Now, science, that Dr. Craig talked about morals. Science develops morals without her being God in this case. I would argue that the worldview guiding the moral and spiritual values of essentially everyone in this room is not a worldview given to us by religion, but a worldview given to us by science. There's no need for God to do the right thing. Reason is what guides you. If you stop believing in God, and if Dr. Craig stopped believing in God, I doubt he would go out and kill his neighbor. Reason guides our actions, and reason based on empirical evidence and knowledge of the world. And in fact, morality evolves over time. In fact, Dr. Craig agreed that in our society, morality evolves over time because we learn things. We get rid of the immoral dogma of the Judeo-Christian religions. The fact that gays are evil. Well, we now know that, in fact, homosexuality is common in all mammals. It's not unnatural. It's absolutely normal. Women are not chattel. Unlike the last pope who's still alive, condoms don't cause AIDS in Africa. In vitro fertilization, allowing people to have children, is not evil. It's good. Now, there are certain universal morals which we can talk about. In my institute, we've talked a lot about them. You can ask, do different cultures have different reactions? And I don't have time to go in it. But they can be overruled. So we have biological responses that are hardwired. But even those can be overruled by reason. And I want to bring up an example which I used with the Islamic guy and offended him incredibly. Maybe it'll offend all of you and Dr. Craig. I don't know. It involves incest. We all have a revulsion, a natural biological revulsion against incest. And there's a good reason. It's a biological taboo. Genetically, sexual reproduction by siblings is bad. And that biological revulsion means we have taboos against it, which then get enfranchised in societies. But I would have to say that let's take the example of a brother and sister, an adult brother and sister, who decide they love one another, decide to have sex, decide to use protection so they won't reproduce. Is that morally wrong? I can't say it is, frankly. Now, the best example that a belief in God is unreasonable is sitting next to me. I've listened to Dr. Craig over the days, and I've changed my opinion. I'm much more charitable. I came here convinced, based on my past interactions and his writing, that Dr. Craig was a dishonest charlatan. But I don't believe that anymore. I think Dr. Craig earnestly believes deeply in the issues he was talking about, so deeply, and as a man of intelligence, he is convinced that there must be a reason he believes that way, and he finds every possible rational argument that he can invent that satisfies him. So any argument that validates God is reasonable to him, and any argument against it is not only unreasonable, but wrong and worth distorting, because it must be wrong. He's decided the answer in advance. And I want to give you some examples. The best example, one of the examples I used before, is this awful aspect of the immorality of the Old Testament, Deuteronomy, where God tells the Israelites to kill all the Canaanite children and women and children and kill everyone in the cities. It's awful. That's the reason we're happy we've gotten rid of that. We don't know, it's in the modern world, we don't appease genocide because we say God did it. Or if a woman drowns her children because she hears God telling her to, there are places for people like that. And Dr. Craig likes children, but in order to validate this, this is what he's written. Why take the lives of innocent children? If we believe, as I do, that God's grace is extended to those who die in infancy or as small children, the death of these children was actually their salvation. God does these children no wrong in taking their lives. So in fact, if they were Canaanite children in that schoolroom that he talked about, it'd be okay. It's worse, though. It becomes more obscene. Who does God wrong in commanding the destruction of the Canaanites? Not the Canaanite adults, because they were bad. Not the children, because they get eternal life. It's the poor Israeli soldiers who had to kill them. They're the ones who are wrong. And then he's gone back and thought about it and says, you know what, I've rethought about it. And really, the real problem is the command was just to drive them out of the land. If they just left, they wouldn't have had to been killed at all. Only those who remained behind were to be utterly exterminated. That's okay. That kind of genocide, rationalizing genocide in that way is not reasonable, but those are the lengths you have to go to. I have about 2 minutes, is that right? Now, what amazes me is that we've had these discussions the last 3 days, and Dr. Craig keeps repeating the same arguments, even when I've showed him that they're wrong, that the science is wrong. He used these arguments, and this is a version of what the argument he used today. Item number 2 is, if the universe had an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. This was from his slide before. It's now called transcendence. But let's look at that. I mean, that is one of the silliest, unwarranted statements I could ever imagine. It reminds me of the Sidney Harris cartoon where there's an equation, and in the middle you can see, then a miracle occurs. And the guy says, I think you should be a little more explicit in step 2. I mean, I could replace God by anything in that, by turtles, or Zeus, or quantum mechanics, or better still, unknown. We just don't know it. But what logic is saying, if the universe has an explanation, it must be God? It's for a man of his intelligence, it's totally silly. Now, I just threw these things in. He keeps quoting Alex Vilenkin that this theorem works. Alex Vilenkin, wrote me an email after our first debate saying, you know what? It doesn't work when there's quantum gravity. It's not true. It's not even true in the multiverse. But he's so convinced that these arguments must be true, he won't listen to the fact that they're not. Fine-tuning? You've already heard it. Life was fine-tuned. We got rid of it with Darwin. The universe can be involved in natural selection and the fundamental constants if there are a number of universes, for example. But the main point is, just like the fact that you and I are not fine-tuned for our existence, we get backaches because we're not used to designed to be sitting at computers, the universe actually could be tuned much better for life. This argument that it's fine-tuned for life is nonsense. And the last thing, Dr. Craig used 5 syllogisms. The problem with syllogisms is they're as only good as the initial postulate. Once you accept that blindly, then you come up with nonsense. Let me give you an example. All mammals exhibit homosexual behavior. William Lane Craig is a mammal. Okay, I think you see where I'm going. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. And it's nonsense because the premise is wrong, and you have to be much more careful in your premise. You can't be so simplistic. And the last thing I will say is that Dr. Craig the other day said the biggest problem for him in terms of understanding and believing in God was the problem of human suffering, and in this case, the suffering of animals. How could a compassionate God let animals suffer? Well, his answer is a compassionate God wouldn't, and therefore they don't. They're not self-aware, and they don't suffer. Now, the point is, and I guess I won't show it. I was going to show these videos. They're kind of remarkable. A group did a video saying, you know what? All the scientists say that all these statements about pain receptors and prefrontal cortex and all the things Dr. Craig was talking about are wrong. Every single scientist. Dr. Craig then did a podcast saying, no, and distorted it, they responded, and it's kind of amusing to listen to, and maybe I'll post it somewhere. But the point is, the reason Dr. Craig distorted what they say, and as I said, they quoted every scientist, let the scientists see their statements to see if they misrepresent them, is because he believes that a compassionate God would not allow it, and therefore animals must not suffer, independent of the scientific evidence. And that's the problem. So to summarize, by replacing God with reason and empirical inquiry, science provides gifts in return. The universal invitation to question anyone's claims and the universal requirement to exercise due diligence and duty of care to substantiate those claims. What we call reason is testing your ideas against external reality, checking for internal consistency, and then testing again, and using that as the basis of future actions. That's what we call acting rationally. A belief in God doesn't satisfy any of those criteria. And my main goal tonight is not to worry about God, but to encourage the broad use of these gifts, because that's what matters to me. And I think that's what can make the world a better place. Thank you.
Okay, we come now to the second part of the evening's entertainment, some questions for our two speakers and some further discussion and engagement between them. I'll start with a question for Dr. Craig. I'm interested in the way that you interpreted the question. Were you saying that reason doesn't forbid one from believing that God exists, or were you saying that reason requires you to believe that God exists?
What was the first part of the question?
That reason doesn't forbid you from believing that.
You?
So it permits you. Reason permits you to believe, or but merely that, or are you saying that reason requires you to believe that God exists?
Interpreting the question under debate tonight was difficult. What does it mean to say it's reasonable to believe something? At one level, it seemed trivially easy to prove that it's reasonable to believe in God. Namely, look at all of the brilliant philosophers, scientists, historians, and so forth who do believe in God and who seem to be quite reasonable people. It doesn't seem that reason would forbid believing in God. But I wanted to shoulder the burden of proof. I wanted to make it more difficult for my side. So I interpreted the question, as I said, to mean, are there better arguments for God than against God? And it seemed to me that if there are better arguments for God than against God, then the rational thing to do would be to believe in God. So that was the way I interpreted the question for tonight. And that requires you in the audience then to weigh the arguments I've given for God and Dr. Krauss's arguments against God, and then make up some sort of decision.
Can I jump in?
Sure,
Just
sure.
a second.
You get a go.
There's one fallacy in the first part, which you're saying is less stringent than what you tried to show. And that's it. Some scientists believe in God. Well, some scientists are Republicans. It doesn't prove anything. Or we'll vote for the Liberal Party here in Australia. The point is that people can believe. We seem to be able to, and each one of us believes 10 impossible things before breakfast to get up and go to work half the time. The fact that you can believe in completely inconsistent notions is not, doesn't prove that both of those inconsistent notions are true. It means that people can do that, and we all do it. And so I don't think that is an argument in favor of the reality of anything. The fact.
Okay, well, as I say, I interpreted the question to require a heavy burden of proof.
Okay.
Okay, so something of a follow-up question this time for Professor Krauss. So it seems to me that on sort of by ordinary standards, there are lots of intelligent, reflective, well-intentioned, well-informed people who believe that God exists and people who don't believe that God exists. Given that there are people of this kind on both sides, is it really plausible to say that all the people on one side are not reasonable? I mean, sure, they're wrong, they're wrong, but are they unreasonable?
Well, you know, you've jumped to the statement that people are unreasonable. The question is that particular belief unreasonable? Reasonable people all have unreasonable beliefs.
Sorry, I mean, in this respect, though, right? In respect of their believing that God exists, are they unreasonable there rather than just being wrong?
Well, look, I mean, the point is there are many, many reasons that people are religious, not least because, unfortunately, we force it down the throats of children. It's very, very difficult to overcome that early teaching. And therefore, it's not surprising. And as I said, it's not surprising. It's kind of amazing that generally you find in Christian society, the children of Christians are Christian, and in our Islamic society, the children of Muslims are Muslim. And I think there's lots of pressure from the time you're a child. And so a belief in something, plus in fact, there's lots of, and we don't have time, well, maybe we do have time to go into the evolutionary psychology. There's lots of reasons to expect that people are hardwired at some level to look for causes where there aren't, to look for the design where there isn't. So there are natural predilections that we're hardwired into, and that's what science tries to overcome. Those natural predilections to believe in that coincidences are significant, to check them, to check your own work. In fact, the easiest person to fool is yourself. And as scientists, I don't know how many papers I've seen people almost produce saying, I discovered something wonderful, but then if they're good enough, they check it and find out it wasn't. It was just an accident. And so I think it's not unreasonable. It's a natural human tendency.
Okay, Bill, do you want to comment on that?
Well, no, I think this is academic because, as I say, the way I've interpreted the question tonight is that I intend to provide arguments for God's existence that I think are better than the arguments against God's existence. And you haven't disputed that if one does that, then it would be reasonable to believe in God, even though there are much weaker interpretations of the question that would say that a person who is, say, expert in the area of philosophy and who is a brilliant philosopher and chooses to believe in God seems quite within his rational rights. But as I say, that's all academic. We need to focus on the arguments that have been given pro and con tonight.
And we need to sometimes recognize that the arguments are wrong because,
but that's a double-edged sword, right? I mean, what you said about self-deception and having bad arguments, that applies to you
equally.
Quoting Alex
incorrectly is just quoting Alex Valenkin incorrectly. I mean,
Well, do we want to talk about that?
I think it would be good to move on to discuss one of the arguments. So yeah, let's take up the question about the BGV theorem. Okay.
About what?
The Bordet.
Oh yeah,
Valenkin
all
theorem.
right. Could we bring up your slide with this private email that you received?
I can go put it back up.
While you're doing that, can I ask you a question about this while you go?
Well, let's see if we need to put the slide up.
So my question is whether there aren't models out there like Anthony Aguirre's steady-state internal inflation models. Don't they just show that the implications of the theorem have got to be very limited?
Well, the point is, as Alex pointed, look, first of all, this is a red herring in the first place. It's like, I'd like to sort of use Dr. Craig's argument, although we're now on a first-name basis, so I'll call him Bill. It doesn't matter whether the universe had a beginning or not. That's not a crucial point. So let me just point out that that's a red herring. As I said the first night, I think if I were going to guess, I would guess our universe had a beginning, namely space and time began. Okay, I guess that's the most likely possibility. But that doesn't mean in any case that there's a God. But you're absolutely right that there are tons of models, and whether you think they're better motivated or more poorly motivated, that involve a contracting phase and then an expanding phase. And in fact, Alex was talking about the fact that he has one. And in fact, that there's one for the multiverse. And the key point is, the theorem itself, as he points out, is only as good as its assumptions. It assumes a classical space-time. We all know that when you go back early enough, you have to consider quantum gravity. By the way, we don't have a theory of quantum gravity. We don't know what's going to happen. So anything's possible because the classical theory breaks down. So it just isn't even applicable at the time that really matters.
Well, I'd like to see this, again, this private email put up on the screen to see who has misquoted Valenkin.
Well, I put it up there so he would quote himself. That's better than actually quoting him, I generally find.
Okay, that's it, isn't it?
Okay, all right. Is it up here?
Yeah. Okay, now notice it says, a theorem is only as good as its assumptions. The BGV theorem says that if the universe is on average expanding along a given world line, this world line cannot be extended or cannot be infinite to the past. A possible loophole is that there might be an epoch of contraction prior to the expansion. Models of this sort have been discussed by Aguirre and Grattan and by Carolyn Chen. Now, the thing is, Lawrence, that in the very paper that I quoted from Alex Vilenkin last April, he shows specifically by name that the Aguirre and Grattan model and the Carolyn Chen model don't work.
No, he said you have to make an assumption about entropy. You have to make an assumption about the evolution of entropy at the point of minimum size. So you have to make an assumption, which he would argue that they don't have any rationale for. That's not the same as saying that they're wrong.
Well, yes, it is. He argues that all of the evidence shows that the universe had a beginning, and that in these
I would agree
models,
all the evidence shows. Let's accept that fact. All the evidence suggests our universe had a beginning. But we don't know. That's what I keep telling you. Knowing and suspecting are two vastly different things.
I'm never saying that this is known with certainty. This is a mischaracterization on your part. What I argue is that the premise is more probably true than false. And actually, you agree with me on that the universe began to exist. But I want to focus
it's likely that the universe began
on
to
this
exist.
claim that I've somehow misrepresented Vilenkin.
Well, but the key line is the last one. That the theorem breaks down to the point when it really matters.
One at a time.
There's more here, because I noticed that at the end of this paragraph, where the Carol Chen and Aguirre-Grattan models are mentioned, that he specifically shows...
Because it was technical. He talked about the fact that you start to assume
hang on a
minimum
second, just let
entropy.
Bill finish.
He specifically shows that these models cannot be past eternal, and that they involve, therefore, a beginning of the universe,
Bill,
just like the others.
You could do the math if you want.
Now,
I'd love you to do it.
Now wait. I couldn't help notice, although it's down from the screen now, that there was a series of ellipsis points following the paragraph.
Yeah, because it was technical, and I thought
well,
it was,
I wonder what you've deleted from the original letter.
No, wait.
I
just told you.
No, wait. Yeah, but you didn't.
I just told you. He says that you assume a minimum of entropy at the lowest point, for which there's no rationalization in the papers and within the context of the model given, and therefore he finds them unpleasant.
Could it have been something like this? You can evade the theorem by postulating that the universe was contracting prior to some time. This sounds as if there's nothing wrong with having a contraction prior to expansion. But the problem is that a contracting universe is highly unstable. Small perturbations would cause it to develop all sorts of messy singularities, so that it would never make it to the expanding phase.
There's a growth. In this paper. That's absolutely right. There are many assumptions about entropy and uniformity that make those models look artificial. But it's not. But that's different than saying they're wrong, especially if the minimum occurs at a point where quantum effects are important and the whole classical theory goes out the window. That's the key point. Quantum mechanics. We don't have a theory of quantum gravity. Quantum gravity is required to understand the universe at t equals 0. Until we do, it's unknown.
Isn't it true that the only viable quantum gravity models on order today involve a beginning, have a finite past?
No.
Well, can you give us one then?
Well, it depends what you mean. There are viable models of a multiverse in which the multiverse is eternal. There are conformally, in fact, I noticed you were maybe, at one point you quoted, no, you didn't now, but I was prepared to jump on you in case you did. Roger Penrose. Right. And there's classically conformal theories that in fact involve a cyclical universe, and they're perfectly consistent at this point, but none of them, the point is all of them have flaws because none of them are a true quantum theory of gravity. So all of them are open to question. In my experience in science, all of them are probably wrong. Because if you know, most theories are wrong, which is why it's hard.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And so I always bet, in fact, I bet the Higgs wouldn't exist, because most simple theories are wrong.
You bet against it.
Yeah, because it just seemed too simple and slimy. But on the other hand, the difference is, while I thought it was ugly, it exists, so I've changed my mind. And in fact, I wrote a paper that showed that fine-tuning that you talk about is natural in the context of the models once you add a Higgs. So I actually explained the fine-tuning just last week.
You're talking about the cosmological constant.
Yeah.
But you know that the fine-tuning extends far beyond that. There's a
as I told you that day,
multiple
we don't
range
have,
of
and here's the
finely
problem
tuned
with the
constants.
fine-tuning argument. Here's the problem with the fine-tuning argument. One of them. There are many of them, but I told you this the other day. We don't know the measure. We don't know the phase space. It is true that life, that many aspects of human life would have been impossible if certain constants were different.
Yes.
Is it surprising It would have been much more surprising if we evolved in a universe in which we couldn't live. Okay? So it's just like saying that a bee knows the color, can find the flowers, the colors of flowers. So it's not because the bee is designed, it's because if they didn't, they couldn't reproduce. No. It's not too surprising that we don't know if you change the constants of nature, whether other life forms with vastly different characteristics couldn't be conscious. We don't even know what consciousness is. So how can you make this assertion that life is fine-tuned? In fact, as I pointed out to you, if the cosmological constant and other constants were changed, there'd be more life in the universe. The universe is not particularly conducive to life. It's amazing we're here. There are asteroids that could destroy us at any instant. The fact is, most of the universe is a harsh, miserable place, and life doesn't exist in almost all of it.
That's irrelevant to the requisite fine-tuning of those initial conditions in the Big Bang, the constants and quantities, which must be in place if anywhere in the cosmos life is to evolve and exist.
No, a life like us.
Hang on.
No.
How do you know?
Because,
how do you know what kind of life can exist?
Because we're not talking about universes governed by different laws of
nature.
No,
I'm just saying all I'm saying is we know of one kind of intelligent life in some of this room. And the point is we don't know what the phase space is. In fact, I wrote a paper once showing that if you made different assumptions about what kind of life could exist, that you'd predict radically different values for the fundamental constants. So we just don't know the answer. It's an interesting question. It's an interesting possibility, and it may even be right. It may even be right that there's a lot of universes, but if that's the case, it's not design. It's natural selection. It's cosmic natural selection. We find ourselves living in a universe in which we can live. Big surprise.
Right, that's not a surprise, but that's not the argument.
But other universes in which the constants are different, either we wouldn't exist or different life forms exist. It's not special creation. It's exactly the same, I was going to say philosophical, it's exactly the same logical problem that people had before Darwin. Everything looked designed. Life looks beautifully designed. It's not.
That is not the same. What we're dealing with here is, if we talk about life in the most general terms, is the ability of an organism to take in food, process it, reproduce after its kind. Life so generally defined wouldn't exist anywhere in the cosmos.
That's not true. For example,
without the fine-tuning.
I'm going to a conference with Freeman Dyson, Lawrence, who's been having a debate with me about this, and we've been talking about exotic forms of life.
Let Bill finish.
In the absence of the fine-tuning, it's not as though there might be different odd aliens that would evolve somewhere in the universe. In the absence of fine-tuning, there wouldn't even be matter. There wouldn't even be chemistry.
How do you know? How do you know?
Because the laws are kept.
There wouldn't be matter like we measure. But if the quark masses were different, there'd be different kinds of matter. In fact, if there were different symmetry groups, there'd be different kinds of matter and different forces. How do you know what's possible if you don't know what's possible?
There aren't different forces.
How do you know?
Because we're considering that subset of universes governed by the same laws, but with different values of the constants and quantities, and therefore we can predict what would happen if those were changed.
One thing you don't understand is a different constant means a different force. The weak force is short range, the electromagnetism is long range, radically different just because of a different constant. If I gave the photon a mass, electromagnetism wouldn't exist anymore. So it's not as if the forces that exist at a human level are different than the constants. If I gave the photon a mass, electromagnetism wouldn't exist, we wouldn't have lights, we wouldn't be here. And so I'm sorry, Bill, you just don't understand the physics. You're out of your depth here.
You're not arguing just with me here. You're arguing with all of the physicists who do accept that the universe is incredibly fine-tuned for intelligent interactive life.
I was one of the first people to point out that to suggest a value for the energy of empty space, which is ridiculously small compared to the naive value, that looks fine-tuned. Now, if you say it's fine-tuned, then people like you jump on and say, it's God. But the point is, as I tried to explain to you, if it was zero, which isn't fine-tuned, there'd be more life in the universe.
The way in which the cosmological constant is fine-tuned is that the life-permitting range is about 1 out of 10 to the 120. It's smaller than its possible range.
But it's 10 to the minus 120 times the value you'd naturally expect. Now, that is ridiculous, and it's the biggest problem in physics, and it excites me. It's wonderful to not understand That's what being a scientist is all about.
Yeah.
Loving, not understanding, not knowing the answer before you ask the question. And so the point is, it's ridiculous. We don't understand it at all. One possibility is it's anthropic. Another is that we might actually have a theory, as I propose, that fixes the value. But what I want to point out is if it was zero, which every one of us thought, which every one of us thought 30 years ago, because it's the mathematically natural value, then there'd be more life in the universe. So zero, which is smaller than the number we see, is a much better value. If you wanted to pick one that isn't fine-tuned, you wanted to maximize the amount of life in the universe, you'd pick a cosmological constant equal to zero.
I don't think you understand what fine-tuning means. It doesn't mean that the cosmological constant couldn't take the value zero. What it means is that the life-permitting range
includes zero.
Yes, the life-permitting range will go to zero to about the Planck energy density. And that
10 to the minus 120 times the Planck energy density.
That life-permitting range is incomprehensibly tiny compared to the range of assumable values.
That's if you don't change any other fundamental constants. If you change delta rho over rho, the energy, the fluctuations in the early universe, then the life-permitting range of the cosmological constant changes incredibly, and the preferred value is very different than the value we pick. So the point is, we don't know what constants of nature are fixed, which ones can change. We don't know. And so it's incredibly, while it's an interesting suggestion, it's incredible overstatement to say we know the answer. We don't know what values change, and I told you, if you change delta rho over rho, the fluctuations in the early universe, the preferred value of the cosmological constant will change by a value of 10 to the fifth. And we don't know, because we don't have a fundamental theory, which parameters are fixed by that fundamental theory, which can vary, whether there are more than one universe, whether we're the only universe. We just don't know. So it is an interesting speculation, and one that I've thought about a lot. But to claim we know the answer is to overstate the argument.
Gosh, Lawrence, you're equating my giving an argument which has premises that are probably true with some sort of certainty, and I'm not suggesting that.
But the premise isn't even probably true. It's like the statement that I made in your other syllogism. It's not true that the constants are fine-tuned to allow intelligent life. That's just not, that's like saying all mammals have homosexual tendencies. I mean, it's just an overstatement that leads to nonsense.
I don't think that's correct, and neither do most physicists.
Well,
maybe we should move on to a different topic at this point. Maybe
actually,
we've exhausted that one.
But one thing I want to say, and I'm sure Bill will agree with me here, we every now and then agree. I appreciate your allowing us to have a discussion. In the other two debates, the moderators felt that that their views were what people were coming to listen to. And maybe they are more rational than Bill or I. But the point is, I really appreciate you allowing us to have that conversation.
Okay, before we turn to take some questions from the audience that have come up on my iPad, maybe we'll move to a rather different subject matter, and I have a couple of questions about this. So, this is a question for Lawrence. Elsewhere, you've raised questions when you've been talking about Christianity, about whether Jesus existed. And I wonder what you'd like to say about, for example, the book of Acts and the report there of Paul's behaviour. I mean, how would you understand that if Jesus didn't actually exist?
I just did that to provoke Bill, but the point is, look, I wasn't there. If you ask me, is the weight of historical evidence such that Jesus was a real historical figure? I'd say the weight of historical evidence is that Jesus was a historical figure. Is the weight of the historical evidence that Jesus was God? No. The weight of the historical evidence is that he was a revolutionary. He may have had delusions about being God. In particular, his disciples wanted to deify him, I think. But in any case, I do not dispute that the weight of the historical evidence suggests that he was a real person. Let's get that.
Okay, do you want to say something about this?
Well, what I wanted to say, Lawrence, is that your comparisons of Jesus of Nazareth with Dionysus and Osiris is based upon scholarship that is more than 100 years out of date. And I think that, honestly, you've got to I think you've been fed a lot of misinformation by skeptics and internet infidel types that are really misleading you on where historical Jesus scholarship has stayed. Let me explain two things about this, why this view is gone now. It's over 100 years out of date. Scholars in comparative religion and in the history of religions during the late 19th century ransacked the literature of ancient mythology looking for these kind of parallels to Jesus, and some tried to explain the origins of Christianity from these. That movement soon collapsed, however, primarily for two reasons. First of all, the parallels turned out to be spurious. When you look at these supposed parallels between Dionysus and Jesus, or Osiris and Jesus, they just don't hold up. Dionysus was not raised from the dead. Osiris in the myths lives on in the underworld. The pieces of his body were scattered and reassembled by his wife. He doesn't rise from the dead. So, in fact, there is nothing in the ancient world comparable to belief in the resurrection of Jesus in these myths. What scholars have discovered over the last half century or so is what's been called the Jewish reclamation of Jesus. That is the realization that Jesus was a Jew, surprise, and it's against the backdrop of Judaism that he must be understood. That the proper interpretive context for Jesus of Nazareth is not pagan mythology, but first century Palestinian Judaism. And when interpreted against that backdrop, the Gospels emerge as very credible historical sources. The second the second thing to be said about this myth theory is that there's no causal connection between these myths and these earliest disciples. These kinds of cults of dying and rising gods weren't even present in first century Palestine, and it would be unthinkable that these original disciples of Jesus would have come to believe he was risen from the dead because somebody had said something about Osiris.
Look, okay, I mean, unlike you, I don't want to try and claim I'm an expert in theology or biblical history. So one may argue that the connections are spurious, and I'm willing to accept that fact, okay? But that still doesn't obviate a few things, that there are many different historical... there's a #1 bestseller, as you know, in the New York Times bestseller list by someone who says, Jesus was a revolutionary, his followers trying to deify him. It seems like an interesting and credible argument. I'm not an expert, but I know a lot of people saying, first of all, it's nothing new about that argument.
No,
and the author agrees it's nothing new, but it's an interesting argument. But the main point is, big deal. If someone tells me they saw someone rise from the dead, I have to ask, how likely is it? How likely is it that they're hallucinating? Or how likely is it? I'm skeptical of everyone. So if I want to create a movement, how much more likely is it for me to claim that the head of my movement is divine and rose from the dead? Well, there's a lot of motivation for that. So I'm very skeptical until someone provides me more evidence than hearsay, and often contradictory hearsay or stories written many, many years after the fact.
Well, those are all good points to raise, and they are discussed in my published work on this subject. I did my doctoral work in Munich on the resurrection. And I think that the hallucination theory, for example, has numerous problems that make it less preferable as an explanation. And as for probability considerations, this is this appeal that you made to David Hume again earlier. And I think Hume's argument is simply demonstrably fallacious. He didn't understand the probability calculus. It hadn't been developed in his day.
As did Leibniz, by the way. But anyway, okay.
And so when Hume says that no amount of evidence can serve to establish a miracle.
No, he said the evidence, it has to be such that the evidence that falsifies it is more remarkable than the evidence that supports it. That seems to me a very rational argument. And you can argue that people have disputed, but I haven't heard a rational argument why that statement is wrong. It's really the same statement that Sagan made. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you're going to say that someone rose from the dead, if you're going to say that someone levitated, then you better have, then the claim that it has to be more remarkable to argue that they didn't than they did and I think that's a perfectly reasonable.
You're quoting what's called Hume's maxim, and that is the germ of truth that some philosophers try to retrieve from Hume's fallacious argument. But all that amounts to saying is, which is more probable, that God raised Jesus from the dead, or one of these other alternative theories, like hallucination, apparent death, conspiracy theory.
So let's take the argument that Muhammad rose on a horse to heaven, which a significant fraction of the world believe, even though he rose from the horse in a place he never apparently visited. But that's a different story.
But
so
wait a
hold
minute,
on.
that's crucial.
But
That's crucial, isn't it?
No, because God can do it. God could transport him there, don't you think?
Well, I thought you meant he was never there.
Okay, well, he was never there that we know of in before he ascended to heaven. But there's a claim that people believe, and you've argued that the reason it's true is because people are willing to die for it.
No,
unfortunately,
that wasn't
people
the
are willing to die for that other claim.
No.
And it doesn't make it true that people. I often suggest that claims that people are willing to die for are most likely wrong.
They have to at least think that it's true. But no, that wasn't the argument. The argument was that the very origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection is something that requires some sort of explanation from the historian. Why did this movement arise? Where did this belief come from? It's extraordinarily un-Jewish belief and requires some sort of sufficient explanation. So this is part of the evidence.
Wasn't there a Jewish
that
belief in a
needs to be
Messiah?
explained.
Wasn't there a Jewish belief in a Messiah?
Absolutely, and Messiah.
So there was a lot of people looking for Messiahs back then.
Absolutely,
okay.
and Messiah was supposed to be a military king who would establish David's throne in Jerusalem and command the respect of both Jew and Gentile alike. And it's for that reason that the crucifixion of Jesus was such a disaster for these men. It wasn't just that he was dead and gone. It had completely evacuated any hopes that they might have entertained that this man was the promised Messiah.
Do you not think it's, I mean, if you want to establish something as reasonable, do you not think it's reasonable that a group of disciples would, first of all, miss someone so much that they might see him? In fact, I know of people who've heard voices of dead relatives, and I'm not going to tell them that's what they want to hear. I mean, it comforts them. That's fine. But most of us would argue it's something they need to hear. It's something that brings them peace and allows them to accept the loss of their loved one as one possibility, or the other possibility that if you're a group of hard-done revolutionaries, hey, it's really good to create this story because it makes your leader seem more powerful. I mean, I guess I do want to impugn them, but I mean, I'm skeptical. People are people, and it's just as rational to believe in that as rational to believe that something that's never occurred before in human history, never occurred afterwards, for which there's no direct evidence actually happened.
Well, there is direct testimonial evidence in
after
history.
The fact.
Yeah,
not direct. 30
years
later, if you went to a court of law and said, I saw that happen, and that guy said that 30 years later.
It's much earlier than that in the sources in the New Testament. For
example, how soon after the event?
Like within 5 years.
5 years. Okay, great. So there's 5 years. Stories that are written down 5 years after the fact, making statements which have been oral traditions up to that point, are highly suspect. They would be in any court of law now.
Not in a Jewish context. In Judaism, oral tradition was a highly developed, highly prized skill that was passed on with great accuracy.
But you also realize there are inconsistencies in the different oral traditions. Now, they're minor ones, but they're inconsistencies which represent the fact that they indeed were an oral tradition passed down from mother to daughter or father to son, depending upon whether a matriarchal or patriarchal society. And those oral traditions, after 5 years, after 20 years, after 100 years, become easier to believe because you weren't there.
No, Lawrence, we're talking about within 5 years, we're talking about information about eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus that go right back to the very beginning, to the disciples themselves. And the question you're raising is a good one. Could these have been like bereavement visions?
Yeah.
And I think that you can argue that no, that's highly implausible. In fact, that when you look at the psychology case books, there is nothing comparable to these resurrection appearances. In order to get anything comparable, you have to cobble together independent stories to try to make a composite picture, but there's nothing.
There's so many examples in modern times of people seeing things that are more remarkable. People seeing aliens in the room. People being, having weird sexual experiments done to them by aliens. People seeing their loved ones present in the room with them.
Yes.
It happens all the time.
I say there are these bereavement visions. That's true. But what we're dealing here with is multiple individuals on various occasions, different circumstances, not only people who were believers, but people who were unbelievers, not only individuals, but groups.
Well, I can say the same thing about alien visitation.
No, I don't.
I've debated alien abduction people on stage, and they'll give me examples where whole groups of people claim to see alien spacecraft do things. And as Richard Feynman said, it's much more likely, due to the known inconsistency or irrationality of humans, than the unknown rationality of aliens. These things happen.
I don't think you would be able to show something comparable to these resurrection appearances that would enable you to explain them plausibly as hallucinations. Moreover, hallucinations only attempt to account for the appearances. They don't say anything about the empty tomb, for which we have good historical evidence.
How do we have good historical evidence?
We have
someone told you the tomb was empty. That's historical evidence.
We have multiple independent early sources.
Exactly. We have multiple independent evidence based on claims by early sources after the fact.
Well, of course.
Reported 5 years after the fact.
They go back to within
not
that
the next
early.
Day, not
well, we
the,
don't
when
know
you could have
that.
checked for DNA evidence.
We don't know that. But in any case, this is of a publicly verifiable fact that anyone in Jerusalem could verify, including the Jewish authorities. And the Jewish authorities never pointed to the tomb of Jesus and said, there's the body. He hasn't risen from the dead. In fact, the earliest Jewish polemic entangled itself in a series of absurdities trying to explain why the body was missing.
Well, there are lots of look for Jimmy Hoffa. I mean, there's lots of ways the body can be missing. All I'm saying is look, there are claims, but the claims are outrageous claims, and there's no independent evidence for those outrageous claims. God, as God could, if there was a God, they could do it so much more easily in a way which was verifiable, or more importantly, falsifiable.
It sounds to me as if you're not even open to the evidence, to looking at it.
No, look. When I read physical review letters and I read an experiment and it makes a ridiculous claim about neutrinos going faster than light, I'm highly skeptical, and I try and think of all the reasons it could be wrong, in spite of the fact the experimentalists are excellent experimentalists, and CERN is a wonderful institution, but it's an extremely difficult experiment to do, and I know, based on everything I know about other parts of physics, that it's highly unlikely. And I always use I think I told my mantra from the publisher of the New York Times, that I like to keep an open mind, but not so open that my brains fall out.
No, well, I hope you'll keep an open mind to the evidence for the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. Most scholars who have looked at this and have an open mind think that these do belong to the portrait of the historical Jesus, and I don't find any other explanation that it has the same sort of explanatory power, explanatory scope, degree of plausibility as the hypothesis that these original men gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead.
Well, it's clear you don't. Okay, let's go on. I mean, I accept that you don't.
Okay, maybe we should now move to some questions from the audience. We've got a bit of time left for these. So I think this first one is probably intended for Lawrence. So science gives us guidance and nice stuff, but also chemical weapons and gas chambers. Can you discuss?
That argument, I keep hearing that argument. And Steven Pinker just wrote a great paper. He said, well, you know what? People say it about science, but they don't say, you know what? Architects create beautiful buildings, but they also created the Nazi gas chambers. Musicians are great, except Hitler loved opera. I mean, the point is, science is not a thing, it's a process. It's a process that allows you to separate fact from fiction, nonsense from sense, make predictions that work, and make the universe a better place. Now, it is a human activity, subject to human constraints, political and economic ones. And in my opinion, so the process is not evil. Every human process can produce things that happen in both directions. What we need to do is, in fact, and the reason I come to places like this is to explain what the process of science is, so we can use it, so people can then make public policies based on empirical evidence that are sound and reasonable, not based on ideology or dogma. And the use of science that you're talking about is based on power, dogma, ideology, and the more we get people to be skeptical of politicians and their leaders and their religious leaders and the scientists, the better informed public and the better democracy we'll have.
The point is, The point is that the process of science is morally neutral, and therefore it does not provide a foundation for objective moral values and duties. As you said, for example, your illustration of incest, the most that is shown is that it's taboo, but being taboo is very different from being objectively morally wrong.
No, we've had this discussion ad nauseum. The point is, science, first of all, is based on honesty, transparency, no authorities.
And those assumptions can't be scientifically justified.
Those are ethical things which I just wish, for example, were true in the Vatican. Okay? And the argument that some things are the argument of right and wrong depends. You don't have to mention the word God. Reason alone can argue that it's not sensible to allow murder to happen in the streets all the time. Because, in fact, if you want to have a productive society, and in fact, the laws of Australia, the laws of the United States, aren't based on the Bible. They're based on a constitution, based on determining, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, everyone is born free but lives forever in chains. We live in a society. We're constrained by the fact that we live in a society, and we have to try and, therefore, we're not free to do X, Y, and Z because it causes the society to have disorder, disruption, lack of productivity, starvation, etc. And so there's all sorts of rational reasons not to behave badly, and I continue to argue that I think most of the people in this room don't behave badly for rational reasons, not because God's going to send them to hell if they behave badly.
The question isn't how people behave. The question is, what is the foundation for the objective moral values that we want to affirm? Your point actually supports me. What your point shows is that these are just social conventions, like in Australia driving on a different side of the road than in the United States.
Or in Christianity, one thing, or in Islam, another. There's no objective moral code because every religion has a separate objective moral code, and they're mutually inconsistent.
You're trying to escape the point that science is ethically neutral. It needs to have ethics from the outside, not from itself.
It's based on an ethos. It's not ethically neutral. That is a misrepresentation of science. It is unethical to be dishonest. It's unethical to hide results that disagree with your premise. All of the science doesn't work if you're not ethical.
Well, this gets back to our discussion in Brisbane. Remember, I argued that science would collapse without the assumption of these sorts of ethical values.
But they don't come from God.
They cannot be scientifically justified. Science merely tells us how the world is. It doesn't tell us how it ought to be. That moral ought has to come from some other source.
It tells me, for example, it tells me that gays aren't bad. It tells me that because biologically, 10% of every mammalian species has homosexual, in fact, some long-term homosexual partnerships in sheep, for example. And sheep are not immoral or unnatural. So it tells me that certain moral presumptions that are claimed to be universal and objective are just nonsense. So science does inform my morality. I can't have a morality if I don't know how the universe works. If I don't know the consequences of my actions, I can't determine what's right and wrong.
We done with that question?
Well, no, I mean, because on Dr. Krauss's view, in effect, we just are sheep. We're animals, just relatively advanced
We animals
primates,
with a brain.
And in the way that I don't see any reason to think that you can have an objective moral ought that derives from science.
There is no such thing as an objective moral ought. Give me one. Every religion has different objective moral oughts. They change over time. We use our reason, and you even said the other day in Brisbane, we've improved in our morals. Didn't you say that?
Yes.
Okay.
Moral growth is
because
possible.
we've learned things.
Well, yes, but that moral improvement is only possible if there is a standard against which moral change can be judged as better or worse.
And that standard is reason.
In the absence of a standard, it's just moral difference, but not moral change, or not moral improvement or degradation.
And the standard is reason and rationality.
Reason and rationality
well, I would
don't
argue
tell you how
is.
things
I mean,
ought
that's
to
where we
be.
differ. I mean, we're not going to probably make progress
do you really think that nihilists or amoralists like Bertrand Russell, Nietzsche...
Bertrand Russell wasn't amoral. He argued strongly against war, which you were arguing against the other day. I mean, there are many things that... I mean, to call Bertrand Russell amoral
I'm
is an
talking about his
obscenity.
view, Lawrence, not the man.
Okay.
He himself said he doesn't know how to reconcile his own affirmation of moral standards, his anti-war positions in his cases for sexual freedom, with his own ethical theory, because on his own ethical theory, there just isn't any basis for affirming that. I mean, in fact, on your own view, you're a determinist, right?
It depends what you mean by determinist.
You do not
The laws
believe
of
that we have
quantum mechanics are second-order differential equations that are deterministic, yes.
And you think that all of our choices and decisions are determined?
No, I said the fundamental laws are deterministic. Do we act in a world as if that looks as if we have free will? Absolutely.
Yes, that's right. In your Stockholm debate, you said, we act and cannot help but act as if we had freedom of the will. But in fact, on your view, we don't.
At a fundamental level, look, we've already, at a fundamental level, the equations of physics are deterministic. Our actions, however, it's just like, we are complex beings, and to determine all of the variables that affect our decisions make us effectively act, operationally act,
yes,
as if we have free will, indistinguishable from individuals that have free will in an operational sense. And since I'm a physicist, what's operational is what matters to me. Now, someday, we may completely understand consciousness. We may be able to completely understand and determine what actions people make based. I doubt it, because it's incredibly complex, but it may happen someday. I just don't know.
Moral responsibility is incompatible with determinism. All you're saying is, on your view, we're so complex that we have to act as if we have freedom of the will and are not determined in our choices. But if your choices are determined, then
I said the
moral
fundamental
responsibility is impossible.
Bill, we're talking about different things. I'm saying the fundamental, just like I'm saying that knowing the fundamental forces of nature does not explain, that does not allow you to appreciate a Mozart concerto. It's a very different thing. It's a whole different level of complexity, emergent phenomena. There's a whole bunch of different, so as I've often said, and my friend Frank Wilczek, who won the Nobel Prize, said, this theory of everything that people are claiming is really a theory of very little.
Yeah, that's
It's a theory of quantum gravity. Knowing a theory of quantum gravity is interesting to us physicists because it'll tell us how the universe began, but it won't explain the details of human consciousness, which we don't understand. So there's a huge gap between saying the fundamental physics is deterministic and discussing human behavior. We don't even understand consciousness.
But you do think human behavior is determined, right? Our choices and actions are determined by brain states, physical brain states.
What I think is there's no way to a priori, on the basis of initial conditions, physical conditions, to in any plausible way predict a priori what's going to happen to everyone in this room when they go home.
Yeah, that's a different question. That's predictability, not determinism.
Well, you know, the point is that I think the humans make decisions based on many factors, and they make rational decisions, and they can act rationally or they can act irrationally. And I've tried to argue that in many cases you've acted irrationally, but as have I at various occasions, as has everyone in this room. We all act irrationally. We regret it if we understand it, and if we don't understand it, we continue to go on. Anyway.
Okay, another question. So I think this one's for Bill. Do we explain the uncanny applicability of mathematics to the human sciences, like economics, by claiming that God designed our economies?
I do not understand the applicability of mathematics to economics. I don't know anything about economics. So, Graham, I'm going to have to beg off that question. I do know, however, that the applicability of mathematics to the physical realm is something that is uncanny, it's extremely effective, and I think it cries out for some sort of explanation. And why the world is built on this mathematical structure is inexplicable, it seems to me, on naturalism or atheism. But theism gives a good explanation.
Well, I don't think it gives a good explanation. It said God did it, and that's never a good explanation. It's just a cop-out.
Why is that a cop-out?
But hold on, well, listen to me. For 1 second. I'll support you. I don't think mathematics applies to economics. If it did, economics would be a science. It isn't. So I'm going to come to your aid. But, but the unreasonable effectiveness in mathematics is a fascinating issue.
Yes.
But there are lots of questions. First of all, if it was the language of God, why isn't the Bible written in mathematics? First of all, okay? The point is, nature, if it's explicable at all, is explicable in terms of some language. It's also not that surprising to me that human beings, arisen as natural entities, with consciousness that has arisen by natural processes, have discovered a language that works. But some language had to work, and it is amazing that it's the language of mathematics instead of any of the other human languages, and that is a remarkable fact. But something had to work if the universe is going to be explicable. Now you may say the fact that the universe is explicable is a miracle, and you're welcome to say that. Okay. But
Good.
it doesn't. But the fact that the universe is explicable is remarkable. But being remarkable and being a miracle are two different things.
Right. Something that's remarkable cries out for explanation. We wonder.
But it doesn't always cry out for explanation in terms of an intelligence.
Well,
it's like
but
saying that you see an unidentified flying object, and it must be aliens from another civilization instead of swamp gas.
Well, but see here, I'm looking for what sort of other explanation the naturalist might offer for the incredible, complex mathematical structure of the physical world. And as I say, if
why didn't God reveal that to them?
If mathematical objects are just abstract entities that are causally isolated from the world, that can't be an explanation. If they're just useful fictions, then how in the world did nature come to be written in the language of these fictions? It seems to me
mathematical models model the universe. They provide a good approximation. In fact, in general, they're an approximation to nature. There is no theory.
That's amazing.
There is no mathematical model. Let me make this clear and precise. There is no mathematical model that exactly reproduces nature at all scales. Every mathematical model written down is an approximation.
Okay, and the question is, what's the best explanation for that amazing and remarkable fact? The theist, in his worldview, has a ready explanation, namely, God built the physical universe on the mathematical structure that he had in mind. And so there is a correlation between that mathematical structure and the physical universe. But in the absence of a designing cosmic mind, the applicability of mathematics, as Mary Lang says, just seems to be a happy coincidence.
No, as I repeat, it is a very useful way to model the world. We can model the world with pictures, too. We can model the world with words. There are varying levels of approximation. But, you know, if God was a mathematician, as Hardy may have said, or some mathematician may have said, because mathematicians are weird, the point is, why didn't he reveal calculus to Moses?
Because the purpose of... Does anybody take that as a serious objection?
I think I did.
You know, Galileo said, as you know, that the purpose of the Scriptures is not to tell us how the heavens go, but how to go to heaven.
Yeah,
so the purpose of the Bible is not to communicate the infinitesimal calculus.
And it's not a scientific document, you will agree.
Right, yeah.
Even though the other day when you argued the fact that the Bible predicted the universe had a beginning was an example of the scientific veracity of the Bible.
No, well, yes, in a sense. What I said is that it is a prediction which can be either verified or falsified by science, and that science has in fact verified that.
So it is a scientific document in that regard. Not the fact that it got the order of creation wrong in Genesis or any of those things, but the one thing that happens to agree with what is likely to have happened, the universe had a beginning. So you found one thing that's right, and therefore it's a correct scientific prediction.
What I said was that prediction has been scientifically verified.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. Yes.
Now, just like the prediction in the Rig Veda that the universe began is scientifically verified, and all the other creation myths, which involve the word creation, meaning something arose, the universe arose, they're all been scientifically verified, so they're all just as
I don't think that is correct. I don't think that's what it says in these other creation myths.
They does
typically
say that,
involve
Bill. Come on, they all say they're called creation myths for a reason.
Oh, but the creation may be a cosmic egg which breaks open, or the blood from a mythological dragon
But you
spills
could say
out,
that,
or the
but we
sperm
all
of the
know
gods.
that you shouldn't. But we all know that you shouldn't take a literal interpretation. Like you wouldn't take a literal interpretation of the 7 days. So why should we take a literal interpretation of that bit of nonsense and not a literal interpretation of the bit of nonsense in Genesis?
That is going to depend upon the literary genre of the literature involved, right? If you're right that these other myths are not to be taken literally, then it would be a literary mistake to take them that way. But
Just like Genesis.
That's the question.
Just like Genesis?
Yes, I do not think that
So the creation myth in Genesis is not to be taken literally.
Correct.
And any
That's correct.
statement about the scientific veracity of Genesis is ridiculous.
Not any statement. I mean, for example, that there are animals and four-footed beasts and sea monsters and sun and the moon. I mean, those are all scientific, but it's not a scientific narrative. It is a figurative narrative, poetic sort of narrative about the creation of the world. I agree
Just like
with
all
you.
the other poetic narratives
Well,
in
that
other
depends.
religions.
Maybe so. I mean,
Okay.
you've got to look
So
at
I don't
them
think
one
you
by
should
one.
disparage the poor Norse creation myth. Those poor dead
The-
Norsemen
well,
would be
now,
very offended.
the question is whether the Norsemen took it literally or not. That's the issue. I mean, we got to look at it on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, I think we've exhausted that.
Okay, so I think we've probably got time for one more question. So what do we pick? Question for Dr. Craig. Do you think that philosophy makes progress? If so, what do you say to those people who observe that philosophers go on discussing the very same questions that were tackled by Plato and Aristotle?
I didn't hear that last bit. Can you repeat the question?
Do you want me to repeat it, or do you
Well, I
want
want
to
to
just...
hear what it was, so when he says the wrong thing, I can jump on it.
What do you say to those people who observe that philosophers go on discussing the very same questions that were tackled by Plato and Aristotle?
Well, I think that the fact that there are the sort of great questions of philosophy that are perennial questions is not a deficit of philosophy. It is part of the glory of philosophy that it deals with the deepest questions that human beings can ask, and those are always questions that every generation needs to ask for itself and re-explore. Things about the meaning of life, whether or not there are objective moral values, whether or not God exists, is there a mind distinct from the body? These are perennial questions that need to be constantly rediscussed. And I think that philosophy does make progress. One example during the 20th century would be the collapse of scientific verificationism. The notion that a sentence is meaningful if and only if it can, in principle, be scientifically verified, was shown to be too narrow a criterion of rationality, or meaning rather, and also to be ultimately self-refuting. And so I think philosophy does make progress over time, and that would be one illustration of it.
Well, I agree with some of what Bill said. I think that philosophy has traditionally asked deep questions. We're all philosophers because we all ask those deep questions. And boy, I'm going to come to the defense of philosophy for the first time.
That's amazing.
A
miracle.
It's as much of a miracle as anything else you've discussed. But anyway, philosophers are trained to critically examine questions and look at them logically, and that's very useful. So philosophy has raised interesting questions. Science goes about trying to answer them. That's it. Okay? The question is, does philosophy make progress? Of course it makes progress, because science makes progress. So philosophers can ask ever more interesting questions because they're informed by the knowledge of the physical world. And so philosophy doesn't create the knowledge. It reflects critically on the knowledge, allows us to assess its implications, and maybe even act more rationally based on those. I think philosophy is useful for that. It doesn't generate the knowledge, science does, and that's the difference.
Well, knowledge is broader than just scientific discovery. I mean, by reflecting upon scientific data, one can come to conclusions and derive new knowledge, and philosophy is a source of knowledge in that sense.
Well, one could derive things which one can go out and test, and I call that science. But, I mean...
Well, yes, you have a very broad definition
of science,
as we saw in Sydney, of what you mean by science.
My definition of science is empirical investigation and rational thought and falsifiability. And we all do it every single day. And I wish we did it more. Maybe that's a good way to end. I don't know.
Okay, so Robert will have a couple of things to say after I finish speaking. I'd just like to say a couple of things in conclusion. First of all, on behalf of Dr. Craig and Professor Krauss and the organisers of the event, I'd like to thank everybody in the audience for coming tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've been stimulated by the proceedings. To you. So, and second, on behalf of the audience, I'd like to thank the organisers for making it happen, and I'd especially like to thank and congratulate Dr. Craig and Professor Krauss for their sterling performances tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.